My daughter just got back from her school's outdoor education trip, and listening to her excited stories brought back a memory I've tried hard to forget. This happened back in 2014, when I was 26, and going through one of the worst periods of my life. I'd just ended a 3-year relationship and lost the apartment we'd shared together in Seattle. I was back living with my parents, working at a call center, and spending every weekend doing absolutely nothing. A coworker named Tom noticed how miserable I looked and started telling me about his solo camping trips in the Cascade foothills. The way he described it, sleeping under the stars, building fires, completely disconnecting, made something click in my head. I'd loved camping as a kid, but always with groups. The idea of going alone suddenly felt like exactly what I needed. I spent the next week planning obsessively. I bought topographic maps, marked potential campsites, and figured out which transit lines would get me closest to the trailhead. That Thursday in late September, I packed light and left work early, catching the 3:15 bus heading east out of the city. I remember the sunlight coming through the bus windows as we wound through the hills, how warm it felt on my skin. For the first time in months, the heavy fog I'd been living in seemed to lift. I actually felt something like hope. The bus dropped me off around 5 p.m. I hiked about 2 hours into the forest, found a spot that seemed perfect, secluded, flat ground, near a small creek, and set up camp. I cooked instant noodles on my camping stove, lay in the grass watching the sky darken, and felt genuinely at peace. By 11 p.m., I was exhausted in the best way. I crawled into my sleeping bag and read for a bit before passing out. Around 3 a.m., something woke me up. At first I was completely disoriented, half dreaming that I heard my nephew crying in the next room. Then reality snapped into focus, and adrenaline flooded my system. I was alone in the woods, and someone was making noise out there. It came from somewhere behind my tent, a weird rhythmic sound that rose and fell. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a coyote. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I checked my phone, 3:17 a.m. I lay there trying to calm down, and then it started again, closer this time, louder, and it didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded like someone sobbing, gasping for air between cries, the kind of crying that comes from complete breakdown. Then came a banging sound, metal on wood, over and over, like someone attacking a tree with a crowbar. It went on for maybe 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then a scream tore through the forest. Not a shout, a scream, raw and full of so much pain and rage that my hands started shaking. It was definitely a man's voice. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stay still and think. After a moment of quiet, I heard muttering, incoherent rambling punctuated by another scream, and then words. Why? Why? More sobbing, more incomprehensible babbling. I caught fragments. The water burning, gone. Then, why did you leave me? Marcus, why did you fucking leave me? I could hear footsteps now, stumbling through the underbrush, getting closer. The person was moving erratically, falling, getting up, hitting things. I crouched in my tent, barely breathing, trying to track the movement by sound alone. And then nothing. The footsteps stopped. The crying stopped. It was like whoever it was simply vanished. I checked my phone, 3:52 a.m. After 10 minutes of complete silence, I carefully unzipped my tent and looked out. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing and the tree line beyond. Nothing moved, no sounds at all. I stayed there, crouched by my tent, scanning the forest for another 10 minutes before climbing back inside. Strangely, I eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up at dawn, I packed faster than I've ever packed anything and started hiking out. As I passed through a section I'd walked the day before, I spotted something dark draped over some bushes. I almost kept walking, but curiosity won. It was an old military-style jacket, torn and filthy. I used a branch to flip it over, and underneath was a metal mallet, the kind used for driving tent stakes, but bigger, heavier. The handle was wrapped in duct tape. I didn't touch anything, I just ran. When I got back to Seattle, I filed a report with the police. They took my information but seemed skeptical. No crime had been committed after all. I've never gone camping alone again, and whoever that was screaming in the forest that night, let's not meet. Last October, I took my 2 daughters to a family campground, about 3 hours north of where we live. My wife had to stay behind for work commitments, so it was just the 3 of us for the long weekend. I'd been camping plenty of times before, but never solo with the kids, and I'll admit I was a bit nervous about managing everything on my own. We arrived late afternoon, and by early evening the heat was still oppressive, had to be pushing 90 degrees even as the sun started to drop. Our tent felt like a sauna, so I took the girls to the campground pool to cool off before dinner. We had the place to ourselves for maybe 20 minutes before a group of older folks showed up. 3 couples who clearly knew each other, laughing loudly and taking over most of the pool area. Nothing wrong with that, but the vibe shifted, and I figured it was a good time to head back to our site anyway. We dried off and I started getting our camp stove set up. My oldest was helping me organize our supplies, while my younger daughter played with her toys near the picnic table. That's when I noticed one of the men from the pool walking up our gravel path. He was maybe in his 60s, wearing cargo shorts and a faded baseball cap. He stopped a few feet from our table and smiled. "Saw your plates," he said, gesturing vaguely toward where our car was parked. "You folks from the northern part of the state?" I felt my guard go up immediately. Who walks up to a stranger's campsite and admits they've been checking out their vehicle? But I kept my voice neutral. "Yeah, up near the lakes," I said, keeping it vague. "Ah, I used to do some contracting work up that way," he continued. "Small world." I nodded but didn't elaborate, hoping he'd take the hint. I focused on the camp stove, giving short responses. He asked if I was just visiting for the weekend. I told him we were. He volunteered that he actually lived at the campground year-round. Apparently a lot of the sites were permanent or seasonal setups, not just weekend campers like us. The conversation fizzled out after a few more awkward exchanges, and he eventually wandered off. I felt uneasy, but told myself I was being paranoid. Campgrounds are communal spaces. People chat. It's normal. The next morning, I woke up early to make breakfast for the girls. The campground had this small covered cooking area for tent campers, 3 walls with a roof, and the 4th side open except for a raised planter box that created a narrow entrance. I was in there with my youngest, getting the portable griddle heated up, when I saw him approaching again. My stomach dropped. The setup of that cooking shelter meant I was essentially boxed in. He was standing right at the only exit, and I'd have to squeeze past him to get out. My daughter was oblivious, chattering about pancakes, but every nerve in my body was screaming. "Morning," he said, that same smile on his face. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual while positioning myself between him and my daughter. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, it's pretty unusual to see a guy out here alone with his kids like this. Most families, the dad doesn't come without the mom." The way he said it, the emphasis, the observation, it wasn't casual small talk. He'd been watching us. He'd noticed my wife wasn't there. He was pointing out that I was alone. I forced myself to stay calm. "My other daughter had a soccer tournament," I said. "We split duties. Someone had to bring these 2 camping." "Makes sense," he said, but he didn't move. I looked him directly in the eye. "Plus, my wife's the one who usually handles the camping anyway. I'm just the guy who brings the hunting rifle." His expression changed instantly. The smile vanished. "Right," he said quietly. "We'll have a good breakfast." He turned and walked away without another word. I didn't see him again for the rest of our trip, though I kept looking over my shoulder. We packed up and left first thing the next morning, a day earlier than planned. I never told my daughters why we cut the trip short. This happened about 4 years back, and it completely changed how I feel about camping in remote areas. I was traveling with 2 friends at the time, and I honestly don't know what would have happened if I'd been out there alone. My 2 friends, let's call them Jake and Emma, they were dating, and I were doing a road trip through the Southwest. We'd planned to stop in Alamogordo, New Mexico, mainly for the quirky tourist traps, but we were camping most nights to save money. We found a spot at Carlsbad Caverns State Park, roughly 30 minutes outside town. We spent the afternoon checking out the local attractions, then drove back to our campsite just as the sun was going down. At first, everything felt completely normal. There were some other campers, maybe 100 yards down the road, and we could hear their music drifting over some indie folk stuff, pretty mellow and harmless. Jake and Emma sat by the lantern reading and journaling, while I nursed a few beers and messed around with my camera, trying to get some long exposure shots of the stars over our tents. Eventually the music stopped. My friends called it a night and crawled into their tent, and once I got the shot I was after, I zipped myself into mine. I woke up disoriented, in that weird half-asleep state, where you're not sure what's real. I could hear something crunching in the gravel near my tent. At first I thought I was dreaming, so I just sat up slowly, trying to clear my head and figure out if the sound was actually there. Then I heard it again, and this time it was much closer. Not just closer, it was right outside my tent. Every hair on my body stood up. For a second I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a park ranger checking on something. Maybe we'd forgotten to pay, or left our car lights on. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "If someone's out there, please say something. Silence. Hello? Can you please identify yourself? Nothing. I sat there completely frozen, my heart hammering, and it was dead quiet. I tried to calm down, told myself I was being paranoid, and lay back down with my eyes closed. Maybe 5 minutes passed, and then the footsteps started again, slowly moving around the perimeter of my tent. I sat bolt upright and knew with absolute certainty that someone was out there. Then something happened that I still can't fully process. As I sat there in the darkness, barely breathing, I watched the bottom edge of my tent start to lift up from the outside. Someone was pulling it up, trying to look inside. I screamed for Jake and Emma, yelling that someone was outside, that they needed to wake up now. Everything felt chaotic. They were confused and groggy. I was panicking, and then suddenly I couldn't hear anything anymore. Jake was shouting at me to unzip my tent and look outside, but I was terrified that if I stuck my head out, I'd find someone standing there with a weapon. Finally, I forced myself to look. Nothing. No one was there. We all climbed out and got into the car, and I explained everything while they listened, concerned but clearly not entirely convinced. I insisted something had happened. We decided to shine our flashlights toward the tents from inside the car. Our campsite was surrounded by these rocky outcroppings and a dry wash. As we swept our beams across the rocks, another light suddenly appeared, shining back at us from just beyond our tents. We made the decision right then to abandon everything and find a motel, so we drove back into Alamogordo around 1 in the morning. All night I felt stupid and terrified in equal measure. I kept trying to convince myself it had been a dream, or an animal, or that I'd just psyched myself out. We joked about it nervously, watched some late-night TV in the motel room, and eventually fell asleep. When we returned the next morning, my worst fears were confirmed. When we pulled up, everything looked untouched at first glance. Nothing appeared stolen or disturbed. We started packing up, and I began rolling up my tarp when Jake said, "That's really fucking weird," and waved me over. The bungee cords that secured his rainfly had been cut cleanly through, like someone had used a knife or scissors. His tent was practically brand new. I walked back to my own tent to check, and that's when I saw them, fresh boot prints circling my tent in a complete loop. Prints that were on top of the ones I'd made earlier. We packed up fast after that. We barely even spoke about it. I think Jake is still skeptical about the whole thing, even with his tent cords cut. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but they succeeded in scaring me more than anything else ever has. Whoever you were, tent stalker, let's not meet again.